Hello, ladies and gentlemen. You're all very welcome to the RDS Library and Archives. My name is Natasha Cern, and I'm the head of the Library and Archives here. And I'd like to welcome you now for the second of our talks this afternoon in partnership with the Dublin Book Festival, which is Shifting Sentiment, Media Influence on Public Opinion, featuring Eileen Culloty, Assistant Professor at DCU School of Communications, Dermot Meleady, historian and author of the book Shifting Sentiment, Press Opinion in Ireland, Revolutionary Decade 1914 to 1923, and Irish Times journalist Jade Wilson, in discussion with Donal Fallon, historian and presenter of the podcast Three Castles Burning, who will look at the past and the present to ask, is public opinion reflected or led by media coverage? Just before we start, could I please draw your attention to your nearest fire exit, which is just here. Thank you for your attention, and without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Donal and his guests.
So thank you all for joining us here today in this very, very beautiful library. It's a real honour to be involved with the Dublin Book Festival this year, and I'm wearing a different hat, metaphorically speaking, from usual today. Tommy Graham, editor of History of Ireland magazine, has mastered many things, but even he has not figured out how to be in two places at once. So I, from further reaches of the magazine, Bite Size and Museum Eye, have stepped up into his place. And it's a very significant year for us. History of Ireland just turned 30, and hopefully many more decades ahead. Our conversation today is in part a historical one, but it's also about the present and indeed the future of the media. And I suppose what we're looking at is this big question: is public opinion reflected or led by media coverage? I like how broad that question is. It allows us to get into a lot of other things around the changing media landscape in Ireland and the changing political atmosphere, perhaps. Our newspapers are changing. Increasingly, they are online. Not yesterday's news today anymore, but real-time coverage of the ongoing. And the media, of course, as we'll hear today, is much more than just newspapers. Is there a uniquely Irish dimension to this tale today? I mean, a quick search, just for fun, before I came here, in the Oireachtas archive revealed that the term, quote, the Dublin media, has been used in the Dáil on more than 40 occasions in recent years. Does that mean anything? What is the Dublin media? And in the post-pandemic age, kind of, where does the media sit now too? So we've a lot to get into on a journey that brings us from the revolutionary period through to post-truth, we might say, today. This panel is brilliant because it's a mix of practitioners, people who work in the media, and people who study the media, both historically speaking and in a contemporary sense. Dermot Meleady is the author of a new study that gives this event its title, available at the back of the room from the Gutter bookshop: Shifting Sentiment, Press Opinion in Ireland's Revolutionary Decade, 1914 to 1923. And before that, he authored several studies of a man who knew a lot about the power of the press, the nationalist leader, John Redmond. And we're going to talk about his book and the approach he's taken. Very refreshing, actually, because normally when people go into the newspaper archives, even a century ago, they focus on those big national papers. Instead, Dermot's study is around the local press. Eileen Culloty is the assistant professor in the School of Communications and deputy director of the Institute for Media, Democracy and Society at Dublin City University, co-author of a very important and timely study on disinformation. There's a word we're using a lot in recent years, and manipulation in digital media. Really fascinating work that examines issues like the influence of bad actors, those who consciously produce and distribute disinformation. Jade Wilson is a reporter with the Irish Times, the paper of record. Actually, before we came on, we were talking about what does that mean to be the paper of record. Maybe we get into that later. But broadly published across the Irish media landscape. I first encountered her work within GCN, which is Gay Community News, marking 35 years in existence this year. But she brings interesting perspectives today as someone who works across print media, also featured on radio, and she was shortlisted for Foreign Coverage of the Year and Young Journalist of the Year in the 2002 Newsbrands Awards in Ireland. So a very great, diverse panel. Dermot, to begin with you, right? The period your new book covers is a really exciting time in Irish media history. You had the big players, the Freeman's Journal, the Irish Times. You had a network of revolutionary papers and underground newspapers like the Irish Bulletin. But in your introduction, you make the point on why you think the provincial press, the local paper, can be particularly important in opening up this time. And I suppose all national news, was and is somewhere very local.
Okay, well, I was looking for a type of media expression of public opinion which would be more intimate, closer to the people of the country. In other words, this was an era before scientific opinion polling, and it seemed to me that the editorials of small, local, regional newspapers would be the best possible way to approach the state of opinion in those localities. The national papers were sort of opinion-led, if you like, or they sought to lead opinion. By the way, I'd have to slightly correct what you said about the Irish Times and the Freeman's Journal being the big players. This was a study purely of nationalist public opinion. The Irish Times at that time was an organ of unionist opinion, and it didn't really feature in controversies between nationalists. The other big player, and by God was it big, was the Irish Independent. I mean, in 1914, the circulation of the Irish Independent was at least 7 times that of the Freeman's Journal. And there was the first chapter of the book is an account of the sort of war, the newspaper war between those two organs of nationalist opinion. So the Irish Times was on the sidelines as a kind of a looker on at what nationalists were arguing about. But it was really the Independent that was seeking dominance within the field of nationalist opinion. But in any case, the question of which leads and which follows, I think it's not an either-or question. I think that at different times and under different circumstances, the newspaper, as it was then, we just use the word media to cover past and present. Yeah. Media opinion was basically led by public opinion in the period of this book. That's as far as the big political events of the day went. There were broad shifts in public opinion, and then newspapers, by and large, came to reflect those currents of opinion. One of the biggest example in the book is the announcement in the middle of 1916, 2 months after the rebellion, of the new scheme to implement Home Rule, Lloyd George's scheme, and the fact that scheme included a provision for 6-county partition, exclusion from Home Rule of 6 Ulster counties. That was a huge. It caused a huge shock, and it therefore brought about a huge change in nationalist public opinion. The newspapers, the vast majority of them, came to reflect that. I'm not aware of any editor who was kind of anticipating this and urging on or seeking to lead public opinion. Now, on the other hand, there at different times, for example, at the times of the by-elections in 1917, where the rising force of Sinn Féin was confronting the Irish Party, the Irish Parliamentary Party, you found that there were specific newspapers were sort of trying to lead campaigns against the Irish Party, against particular candidates in by-elections. So my take on the whole thing is that where broad historical events were concerned, public opinion led the media. When it comes to localized and specific events, the media were the ones trying to lead public opinion. Now, I can also think of just as many cases where newspaper editors tried to generate campaigns, tried to lead public opinion, in other words, and failed. There are instances, for example, there was an agitation before the Rising, in the few months before the Rising, there was an agitation against the Irish Party for not doing enough to protest against high war taxation, and it just didn't take off. There were about 7 newspapers carried editorials on it just to register the fact that they were aware of the issue. But any that did try to lead a campaign against the party on this issue, they simply didn't get traction. And there are other instances as well in the book, but I won't go any further than that at the moment.
At the very beginning, the very outset of your book, you make an important point. You said that in Ireland, the development of mass literacy in English throughout the second half of the 19th century gave a new articulacy to popular sentiments, generating a mass following for nationalist movements. So even on the other side, never mind the regional press, the revolutionary press, I mean, famously, Mr. Joyce subscribed to Sinn Féin. The press wasn't just a building block for nationalism. You had Larkin's newspapers as well. The newspaper printing press was becoming its own kind of vital part of the revolution too.
Oh yeah, very much so. It's interesting you should mention the Larkin's press. Larkin was, in the immediate aftermath of the rebellion, some of the rural-based provincial newspapers lashed out. They were looking for scapegoats to blame for the rebellion. They were all against it. They all condemned it. Some of them put the blame on Larkin and syndicalism. It was a real thing. They had a very dim view of. They took a very dim view of the intrusion of European syndicalist ideas into peaceful Irish.
But Larkin's paper, The Irish Worker, at one point was selling 5 times what Sinn Féin could muster.
Yeah.
I always think that was kind of because he used illustrations, very powerful front page cartoons. When you think about the level of literacy, perhaps amongst the city's working class, but he was giving the people what they wanted in terms of the media and the press.
Well, it was probably giving urban audiences what they
exactly.
wanted. Yeah,
In his sphere.
People in country towns didn't quite see it that way. They saw it as an intrusion.
Terms that we'll definitely be talking about later on today, very contemporary times, also pop up in this kind of period too. I mean, there was an interesting study recently. Michael Barry wrote a book about fake news in the Irish Revolution. You had the Battle of Tralee, images of which were published all across the United Kingdom. Front page news, never actually happened. A fictional stage battle in Dalkey. So there was a media war going on against the backdrop of independence and the Civil War too, and not everything was as true as it seemed.
I looked that up yesterday. I'm not quite sure if it never happened, because there was a real siege of Tralee.
Yeah, but it's Vico Road in Dalkey where you've
Vico Road in
dead
Dalkey.
soldiers on the road.
But the way I interpret that is there was a huge appetite among readerships in Britain and Ireland for pictorial journalism. They wanted pictures, and journalism. There were plenty of newspapers who had print journalists in the Irish regions, like in Kerry, covering things, but they couldn't get photographers there in time. So it was a way of kind of, it wasn't so much staging a fake event which never happened. It was coming to an event that had happened, but seeking to illustrate it for the benefit of readers who had missed out on.
What if you tell the people picking up the Illustrated London News that they're looking at a battle in Tralee and they're not? It's fake news.
Well, technically it's fake news, but it's not fake in the sense that it never happened. You know, there was a real Battle of Tralee. The news clips show British soldiers holding up people, stopping people on the street and with their hands up and making them show their papers and so on. That was an attempt to say, well, this is what has been going on. This is the type of thing that's been happening in Kerry, and we're showing it to you in a I don't know if fake is the correct word, but reconstructed, let's say, rather than faked.
Yeah. Eileen, across the world, all spheres of life have become subject to false information, conspiracy theories, and propaganda. Those words are from your study. A look at disinformation and manipulation in digital media. I suppose at the very outset, the media itself is now so transformed from the time Dermot looks at in his book. And I suppose so is how we consume it. I mean, Dermot talks about the influence of mass literacy in that time. Maybe now, decades into the internet, we're seeing more and more digital literacy and impact there. And I suppose the field of the media is just so new.
Absolutely, but one of the challenges is that people don't really understand media literacy and digital literacy in the same way that it's very easy to understand what we mean by literacy, the ability to read and write. And it's very easy and clear the consequences of illiteracy. We know how tragic that is for individuals, but also for communities in which it's prevalent. So the drive for mass literacy had a great movement behind it. You educate teachers to educate people. When people like me advocate for media literacy and digital literacy, I think the understanding of what that involves is much weaker. But what I would say is that in our current age, to fully participate in society, to fully access your rights as a citizen, which includes rights to information and to being informed, you need to understand the media. You know, who owns it? How is it funded? How might those two things influence agendas? When it comes to the technology companies, what are the incentives they have for the way they organize social media? What determines what you see? And even in the example you were just describing there, I was thinking of during the First World War, it was the first time lots of footage was being filmed and shown in cinemas. And there was, because it was so new, there was no concept of what's permissible. So like horrific images were shown until the UK War Office stepped in and said, I think this is too much. But often things were recreated. And it was that sense of, well, we know this happened. We can't film it directly. So why don't we just recreate it so people could see it for themselves? So I agree with you. I don't think that's fake news because you know, now we would say, well, you have to be honest with people and transparent, but it was totally new to them at the time, so they didn't have that understanding. At the moment, I think a lot of people might feel like they're media literate, or they might feel like they're digitally literate because they own a smartphone. There's lots of people in Facebook groups swiping on TikTok that don't actually understand how those technologies work or what they're doing, and I think that's a real problem. Because a lot of our media literacy education also tends to focus on schools, which leaves a generation of adults at the mercy of new technologies.
Your book, when it was published, is kind of really fascinating. 2021, against everything that was going on, and it recalled to me an observation in Tony Houlihan's recent memoir. He talks about when the gushing cartoons and the murals of him began appearing on the front of newspapers in March 2020, and someone said, this is great, you know, they love us. And he replied to his colleague and said, this will change. And of course, he was correct on that. The pandemic looms large, doesn't it, over any study of disinformation?
Definitely. And there's always been disinformation. There's always been agendas and vested interests and rumors and conspiracy theories. But the pandemic, I think there was a confluence of factors around the pandemic that made it ripe for conspiracy theories and drew a lot more people into them. And one of them was just that pervasive uncertainty and fear, especially back in the early stages of it. And whenever there's uncertainty, people crave something that gives them an explanation that might simplify things. And that's a well-known trend historically. Any period of great upheaval, there's a spike in conspiracy theories. Then when you add in the fact that people were confined to their homes, they're spending a lot more time online. So they're in these online communities. And then just the fact that we have online communities, so something can happen in the US and then it's here instantly. And then many people capitalized on that to further their own agendas and to make money. There's a lot of money to be made in stoking people's fears and making people angry, unfortunately. And the technology platforms enable that. So it's the confluence of all those things together.
I think it surprises people, the amount of money that can be made, for example, creating content on YouTube. Like someone can very quickly amass tens of thousands of followers at a platform like that.
Or even simple things like if you have outrageous stories and someone clicks on it and you just go, oh, what's that about? Clickbait, classically. Yeah. Just the act of clicking on something generates more traffic to a website. Even if you leave immediately, you've generated money for that website. So it's the incentives are all wrong.
So Jade, you come to this differently as a practitioner, as a reporter, and I'm familiar with your work from a whole host of places. Definitely first encountered it in GCN. That's a brilliant publication, by the way, which we encounter for free every month on the streets of the capital. You were there early in your career. What's the landscape like now for an emerging young journalist in this country? Ireland strikes me as having an abundance of publications in literature. I think there were 3 literary journals launched over the course of the Dublin Book Festival this year alone, but surprisingly few in kind of other spheres. When you emerge as a young freelance gun for hire in the media, what's that like?
Yeah, particularly in Ireland, very few. I think there are a lot of problems as a young journalist trying to enter the industry now. It's much more precarious in terms of employment, and more often than not very low pay, and just generally very difficult to get into the industry if you're not from a certain background and don't have certain supports behind you. And I suppose, GCN was really wonderful to work for because they kind of throw their doors open for internships for people. But again, there's that issue of if you're able to access internships because of your financial background. And there's kind of more and more bursaries and scholarships in newspapers at the moment now. And the Irish Times has one, the Mary Marr bursary was just launched, I think it was last year, for people from kind of underprivileged backgrounds. And there are a lot of other issues, I think, in terms of kind of growing mistrust in media as well. So all those things I definitely hear now from people are kind of making it, unfortunately, a more unattractive profession to go into. But there's also...
like growing mistrust. Do you find when you go to someone and you're a journalist for the Irish Times, is there a perception of we talked about this, the Irish Times as the paper of record as was historically viewed, but do you think there's a perception the Irish Times is a liberal paper or a conservative paper, or does that vary based on who you approach?
Yeah, I was saying to you earlier, I think that depends on who you're asking and where you're asking them and when. But I haven't really personally encountered so many problems in that sense. And if anything, I actually think that of most of the papers that I've worked for, I've had a more kind of receptive approach when I go for interviews with people. As an Irish Times journalist, I think there is a sense of trust there. But I do want to say that I think there's also positive still, like particularly in Ireland when you look at it and compare it to other countries. In terms of media trust, there is a greater level of trust in media in Ireland, for example, than in the UK or in the US. Quite a few studies have shown that. And also subscriptions are relatively stable compared to in other countries as well. I think it's like 16% or something at the moment of people who say that they have an active online or print subscription that they pay for. And the Irish Times, and I think it's the Independent, would be the two most common in Ireland for people to subscribe to. It is also a very rewarding career. So I still think it's worthwhile and worth trying to push past the issues.
Given that the title today is Shifting Sentiment, to take a publication like GCN, it's interesting to ponder if it and publications around it, did they shift sentiment on those issues? Do you think that the media in that particular sphere of life played a prominent role in moving opinion?
On which issues?
In terms of marriage equality, in terms of even decriminalisation. The paper was 35 years old.
Yeah, I think particularly with something like marriage equality or referenda, like marriage equality or abortion, and a publication like GCN, those things were won through human stories and like centering individual people and narratives and what it meant to them for your vote to kind of change their lives. And GCN, I remember, published quite a lot of first person or opinion pieces at the time that kind of went beyond its usual audience, which is obviously quite niche usually. So I think definitely played a huge role in shifting sentiment, and also gave a voice to LGBT people who might not have been as well known in the media at the time, and access to a platform that they wouldn't have had normally. I remember stories from like gay teachers who hadn't come out in their schools at the time, being able to use that platform to ask for people's vote, or and then that led to kind of being able to be on other platforms, RTE or different radio interviews. So I think that they played a huge role, and also a sense of comfort for people who felt like they couldn't really look at other media at the time, because it was quite difficult, quite vitriolic at times as well. So definitely, I think, played a huge role in shifting sentiment on that issue.
A question for you, and it's also, I suppose, a question for Eileen, in terms of independent newspapers with reach. I'm amazed how few of them we have in this country. Only really Dublin Inquirer leaps to mind for me in the capital, and they've very much found a niche for themselves, which seems to be civic issues and the city council. Does it surprise you that those kind of papers, they're so common in other cities. You know, London, I know there's larger populations, but even cities of similar size to Dublin, independent newspapers like Dublin Inquirer, they're very, very rare here. And why do you think that is, the two of you? Why is there not more happening in independent news media in Ireland?
I think it's just a feature of how small Ireland is. So the Dublin media and the national media were one in the same. And then as the city grew, there wasn't enough space given, because journalism is operating in a very restrictive environment. So you had national media that then are trying to make sure they speak to the national audience, and then things like Dublin courts and Dublin councils weren't being covered. It is actually a common enough phenomenon. And unfortunately, and linking into your work on a regional press, across the world, regional presses are declining. They call them news deserts, where there's just no news, which means that there's no journalist going to the courts or going to the council to reporting what happens. And now, that's often not the most interesting news to read, but it's really important that it happens. It's a vital part of democracy.
The historians of tomorrow in the archives very much appreciate that being there. Yeah, absolutely. But Dublin Inquirer has done quite well, and I love the way you buy it across the city, the way it's dispensed in those old style news boxes. But it's unusual. I think it's unusual that there hasn't been more like it so far.
I think the Dublin Inquirer is also very unusual because it's relying entirely on subscriptions. It's one of the only newspapers that doesn't rely on or doesn't take money from advertising at all. And I think their subscription models are really interesting to look at. Like the main motivation behind people who pay for the likes of the Dublin Inquirer is supporting small, local, independent media. And I think they bring in about, the last time I read it, like 14,000 a month just through subscriptions that range from €3 to €9 a month. So they're really interesting in that sense. And I think of the Tortoise Shack as well, and other kind of small media like that the people are solely supporting for that purpose of covering councils and covering the courts and stuff.
I won't name any names, but a councillor I heard recently complaining, and he was talking about the Dublin Inquirer, and he said, there were no bloody journalists coming to meetings at the council before that newspaper came along. And doesn't that say a lot, that there was no one there, watching what was going on that very important local level? I think one thing we have to emphasize in this discussion, and your book is really strong on this, is the positive. You write of how it is a mistake to allow the proliferation of disinformation to overshadow the remarkable advances of digital communication. Despite all its flaws, it remains true that the internet and related technologies have been revolutionary in opening up access to information and providing opportunities for expression. I suppose there's always a risk when we're writing about the media and digital media that we do focus in on the rise of the far right, all those other things. But, in some ways, this is a golden age, isn't it, in terms of the media and the ability of people to shape it and to be it.
Exactly. I think we get really trapped in a shock of the new, and anything to do with media. Media by its nature, particularly news media, is focused on now, and it's often one of the biggest criticisms labelled at journalism as an institution is that it has no memory and doesn't remember what happened last week, so everything just tends to be now, now, now. But I don't think it's just journalists that are guilty of this. I think the whole debate around digital media and fake news and conspiracy theories in particular really just try and bracket it off from the past. And there's almost this effort to idealize the past. Like, we should not be idealizing a past in which a very, very small group of people got to decide everything that we see, read, and hear. You had in Ireland like limited television, limited radio, and a handful of newspapers, and that was it. So we should definitely not idealize that. And people themselves had no opportunities to express themselves creatively or politically. You could write a letter to the newspaper, someone else got to decide whether it was published. You could ring up the live line, someone else gets to decide whether you go on air or not. That is not something to idealize. So while, yes, we need to address the bad incentives that are there, part of media literacy and digital literacy should be helping people express themselves and use media. I think there's great efforts around, there's always been a very vibrant community media sector in Ireland, actually, but it was kind of unseen because it's somebody broadcasting from a parish hall.
But especially at the level of radio, very strong network of local radio stations.
We're a nation that absolutely loves talking, and that's really important. Even the whole discussions all this summer about RTE, at the heart of it is we need to have Irish media and Irish people telling our own stories for ourselves and to ourselves. We can't abdicate that to giant technology platforms or multinational corporations.
newspapers and editors and that relationship is so important to this discussion. You know, what is a newspaper's point of view? Is it the reporter or is it the editor? And Dermot, your book charts the changing editorial positions of newspapers throughout a moment of upheaval and its aftermath. I always found it extraordinary how certain newspapers held on to reputations that owed a lot more to do with the editor than anyone else. So, you know, R.M. Smiley in the Irish Times. The Irish Times was perhaps viewed as the liberal unionist paper. The Press was the Fianna Fáil paper. What really comes through in your book was the power of the newspaper editor in times past that seemed great. And I mean, that's kind of shifted too, hasn't it?
It seems to have shifted, yeah. But I think it shifted partly because the issues that they were dealing with up to 1922 sort of ceased to exist. Everything went back to kind of boring normality after that. I mean, the big issues before then were all about national sovereignty and just getting the new state set up. But once it was set up, the national papers were able to deal very easily with anything, and especially the Irish Independent really was the voice of Catholic Ireland for decades. They didn't need the space for local commentary became much more restricted, and they went back to doing the regional newspapers went back to doing what they had been doing before the revolutionary period started, which was reporting and opining, if you like, on matters like tillage, the use of land, local business, you know, just basic bread and butter issues as they concerned localities. They just went back to that. Some of them had, even during the revolutionary period, there were papers that only commented on national politics, maybe once every 6 weeks or once every 8 weeks on average, and the rest of the time they were just sticking to what they knew best, you know, growing potatoes or pig farming, that kind of thing. And no less valid for all that, and no less worthy.
On that point of the editorial reputation of papers, do you think, Eileen, that we in this country, do we think about certain newspapers as this kind of left-right divide in the way that they do in Britain, for example, with the Telegraph and the Daily Mail in one corner, perhaps the Mirror and the Guardian in the other? Do we live outside of that left-wing divide here? Left-right divide?
Historically, we just haven't had that same left-right divide. That's not the divide that animated Irish politics. It was, the Civil War, which you don't necessarily need to fall left or right on. I think also it's very important that the most consumed news media in the country is RTE, the public broadcaster.
Yeah.
And it has a huge influence on, because all media influences each other, and there are strict rules around public broadcasting, indeed all broadcasting, commercial broadcasting as well. But there are strict rules of impartiality. They cannot go to bat for one side. Newspapers, on the other hand, are free to do that. And for the most part, I'm sure everybody can think of some columnist or some paper that they associate with having leanings, but for the most part, news reports by Irish journalists are standard news reports, as in they're balanced news reports. There's a lot of movement where a journalist works for one outlet, then they go and work for another. They don't change their views along the way. So when we associate papers with having a particular view, it's the editorials, it's the opinion pieces. And there have been studies as well of Irish journalists where they're asked about their personal views and things, and then they're asked about how they write, and they generally write to a standard. What's changing is going to change, I think, for what things will get much worse, is that there's now just this emergence of lots of alternative online news outlets that very much are aping that kind of US style. And more importantly, there's nothing wrong with agenda-driven journalism either, but there has to be the standards. So I'm thinking of outlets where they take clips totally out of context to smear someone or attack someone, just totally misrepresent what actually happened or what someone said. And that is against any basic standards of journalism. But there are no laws, there's no definition in law of what a journalist is or what a news outlet is, so anyone is free to say that that's what they do.
We talk about this kind of the left-right divide and how it might not exist here, but when you're looking at disinformation as you do and its increased presence, there is a perception now that much of this kind of conspiratorial thinking in media is taking its lead from the United States and the culture wars that have gripped American society so much kind of spreading here. But that influence of American culture and culture wars is very clear, isn't it now?
But it always was. I mean, like we live in a very globalized world, and America, the US, has been the dominant country in that globalized world. We're also a very small English-speaking country at sea in a massive English language sphere. So we just consume huge amounts of media from Britain and from the US. And unfortunately, I think one weakness of Irish media is that they focus so much attention. So not only are we getting the American news and the British news, then we hear the Irish views of the American news and the British news, and far less about what's happening in other countries, which I think some of the work you do, or your colleague Sally Hayden, for example, just on-the-ground reporting of what's happening in other parts of the world. There needs to be a lot more of that. But then this dynamic with digital media just means it's instant. So earlier this year, back in March, I was listening to a talk by the incoming president of the American Library Association, and she was describing how public libraries in the US are just under attack everywhere. Kind of this fringe extremist wing of the Republican Party trying to defund them, then these extremists going into them, attacking librarians, taking books off of the shelves, accusing librarians and children's authors of being pedophiles. And I was listening to this thinking, like, you know, this is just a sign of how bad things have gotten in the US, and that couldn't happen here. And within a few weeks, like, that was all playing out in libraries across Ireland. So, you know, maybe not everybody knows it yet, but the culture wars have come here, and we're living that American reality.
But there does seem to be a subsection of Twitter that could name 5 American congressmen quicker than it could name the local TD. You know, that American culture wars impact is definitely happening here. Yeah, it's very, very real. It's interesting to ponder, I suppose, where these two, the historical and the contemporary, where they meet. I mean, we've just come through a decade of centenaries on the island of Ireland around big anniversaries. I found the role of the media interesting in that process, actually, in terms of the part that the media played in what we might call 2013 to 2023 in Ireland. I'm thinking about things like the Glasnevin Wall of commemoration, the proposed commemoration of the RIC, remember that? In early 2020, right before the pandemic. Were you surprised by how current it all felt in the media of today and how the decade of centenaries played out in the press?
I was surprised, yeah, especially when the centenary, when the wall was attacked in the cemetery. I wasn't expecting that, nor did I. I thought the commemoration of the RIC that general opinion had moved on to the point where it could accommodate that. So I was quite surprised and taken aback by both of those incidences.
I mean, the Irish Times had to close the letters pages on RIC Gate or Black and Tan Gate, whatever you want to call it.
Really, I
it
didn't know
to
that.
such an extent that it was
Yeah.
right throughout the decade of centenaries, time and time again in the opinions pages, it seemed that commemoration had more to do with the present than the past.
Very much so, yeah. Yeah, that came as... I probably shouldn't have been surprised by that, but I was.
What did you think of that in recent years? It was fascinating for me, actually, to watch the events of 100 years ago playing out in the opinion pages today.
Well, I don't think it's just the opinion pages, though. I think we're drowning in opinion anyway. Just full stop. There is so much analysis and so much opinion pieces, and then the people who have the privilege to be invited on stage to give their opinions or invited to articulate them in the Irish Times or wherever, get to maybe get their voices heard a bit more, but everybody has their opinions. So I think the backlash is partly to that. It's much maligned when Michael Gove said that people have had enough of experts, but I actually think there was something in that, and that people are kind of sick of being told what to think, and that we need to, and doesn't mean we should have a free-for-all. I think in our current age, we need to allow people more opportunities to express themselves and not just go, we're going to get the historian here to tell us this view, this academic over here to tell us this view. And part of remembering the past has to be allowing people, again, to tell their own stories. So coming from rural Ireland, I think some of the more interesting stuff, and in Kerry, where the Civil War was obviously very, as it was everywhere, but in Kerry there was quite fierce and contentious. Some more interesting things were just at very local levels of letting people tell the stories of their grandparents.
On that point of opinions and people are sick of hearing opinions, I found a copy of the Irish Times from 1996 recently, and I was just comparing it to the paper of that day. And one thing that really struck me was there's far more opinion in the paper today than there was then. The opinion pages might have been 2 pages of the paper then, but it seems like analysis is now more and more of the paper, and that's papers in general. Why is that? Is it that reporting on news is now so immediate?
No, and Jade was just describing how, you know, for young journalists, poorly paid, you mightn't even be given a decent contract, so it's precarious. And then, you know, they can just pay someone to have an opinion instead of paying someone to go and investigate things or to go and work on a beat or go and report from other countries. That's what we need, is more proper, hardcore reporting and just less opinion, which is just 10 a penny.
And speaking of that and the value of good reporting, Jade, together with Jack Power, you have a really striking piece in the Irish Times this week about ordinary life in Gaza. And I just want to read a few lines from that, directly from a young person there. "The situation is getting worse. My younger sister has been crying night and day and is scared to death and has a fever. We had to evacuate our building in the blink of an eye. Nothing with us, just bringing our own souls, running in the streets and heading into the unknown." Extraordinary stuff, that kind of reporting. And there are times when good reporting shines and is really vital in understanding an event. But you know, behind the scenes, there are undoubtedly barriers to reporting on conflict like that. Can you tell us a little bit about the process of that piece that you wrote and the importance of that kind of reporting for you?
Yeah, I think that's kind of a strange one because you're having to report from afar. Normally, it would be ideal to be on the ground talking to people, but that particular piece came about because after October 7th, Jack and I were hoping to talk to people in Gaza, and I had been on a reporting trip a year previous in the West Bank, so I had contacts there and also in Gaza through them. So we were just looking to speak to ordinary citizens about what's happening and about how they've been impacted. I think why that sort of piece is important to me is because it centres ordinary citizens and their real life experiences and how war is impacting on them, and you know, they're having to flee their homes or grieve loved ones, and it kind of brings it back to how this is impacting people rather than the kind of facts and figures that can make people feel a bit detached from what's going on. And I suppose the barriers to that particular piece were, as I said, reporting from afar is very difficult, especially in Gaza, speaking to people in Gaza, because there were connection issues. You weren't hearing back from people for a long time. It took a lot longer to write something like that than it normally would, because there were blackouts. People weren't able to respond by WhatsApp. And after the bombing in the hospital as well, you don't hear back from people for over a day. You're not sure if you are going to. And generally, I suppose there are obviously issues with any conflict reporting. It's a lot more difficult now to get the resources to send people, and it's as we know, especially with Gaza in the last couple of months, a lot more deadly for journalists. I think also just generally, like related to that piece, I think sometimes that media maybe has a tendency to simplify conflict. Well, I think it's probably more important to lean into delving into the complexities of conflict, because it's not a simple thing. Yeah, I suppose also why it's important is because of the framing of any conflict. I think media have a central role in why people empathize with certain conflicts or certain situations more than others, for example. We've seen that especially with Ukraine over the last couple of years, as opposed to Syria or Afghanistan, for example. And I think media plays a really vital role in showing people why they need to empathize with certain situations. Yeah. So.
Do you want to come in there, Dermot?
Just wondered, was there any suggestion within the Irish Times that they should send a reporter to talk to ordinary Israelis to see how they were coping in the aftermath of October 7th? Was there a suggestion that reportage from both sides would be
Absolutely, there would always be discussions about making sure there's reported from both sides. I actually work in home news though, so I'm not sure kind of what discussions would have gone on in foreign. I know it's very difficult to have anyone there at the moment in person. We do have a freelancer who's in Israel at the moment and traveling around Israel, speaking to people on all sides. Then coverage that we take from the wires as well, Reuters and other publications.
And in terms of coverage of the war, a couple of things strike me. It's not a war, the assault. A couple of things strike me as interesting about it. One, you can log on to any major news outlet and watch a live feed of bombs falling on Gaza. Some of the news websites have almost like scoreboards, how many people have died here, how many people have died there. But, I mean, does that reflect kind of social media and how we consume things now? It's much more about the big event, the bombs are falling, and not necessarily the processes that led there, like good quality reporting on politics in that region, which has been heating up for more than a year and a half before this happened.
Well, on the good quality reporting, it's like, as we were just saying, there needs to be funding to have people based, and there needs to be space in the media given over to people actually reporting. I'm always struck on the weekends when RTE does its World Report feature, where you get these little snippets from around the world, but it just feels like it's very much contained in this little slot when most of us are barely awake and having our breakfast. And the Irish Times, I think, is very notable that it always has featured good reporting from around the world. But what you're saying about the feeds of the bombs, none of that is new, and that has nothing to do with social media. That is very much military strategy in the US post-Vietnam, where they were paranoid about, they blamed the media, basically, and blamed news coverage, and they thought it was the coverage of the bodies coming back on the news that's what turned the American public against the war, as opposed to the killing of their sons and husbands and brothers, which is the far more obvious reason that turned people against it. And so there was a very clear effort to control images of war and to sanitize war. So by the time you get to the first Gulf War in the early 90s, you get all this language around precision strikes. And this is where the terms like collateral damage, precisely to make us not think of innocent civilians. We just think of collateral damage, which is these vague terms that are very hard to grip onto. And so things like the shock and awe doctrine, which guided the Second Gulf War, and at the time of the Second Gulf War, actually in 2003, what the US military was providing, and you could only access footage via the US military, was best of the bombs feeds. So it was someone's job to curate what are the best of the bombs today, and we'll see what does RTE want, what does Sky want. So when we talk about social media now, again, I don't think we should be idealizing what came before. That was not good. And for all of the problems that are there now, which are also not good, that doesn't mean we just idealize what came before. So at least now we can have more diverse voices. You can actually hear from people themselves. But a massive issue from the Vietnam War on was it is more and more dangerous for journalists to get on the ground, to verify things, to walk around themselves. Journalists are increasingly treated as targets, and that puts us more at the mercy of propaganda, unfortunately.
Wrapping this up, Jade, I was thinking about the way we consume media, how that's changed. And last week on a train, I walked through the full length of a busy carriage just to see how many people were reading a newspaper, and no one was, which I found interesting in itself. So we're seeing people are still engaging with the Irish Times, just doing it on their mobile phone. Platforms are having to go behind paywalls as a result of that. Do you think that's a necessary evil? Are we going to find other ways to increase engagement with our media? Are physical newspapers going to disappear? Are paywalls the future?
I think yes and no. I think it is necessary in some senses. I mean, I think if you want high quality independent journalism, then you have to pay for it. And if we want our coverage to be able to grow, then we need our subscribers to grow and not to have to rely on advertising, especially at a time when print costs and other things are soaring. But I think there's lots of interesting examples of subscription models that I'm not sure which are the best ones to go by, and obviously things are changing all the time, but I was thinking of the Dublin Inquirer earlier and how their subscription model ranges from €3 to €9. I think the €3 is like a subscription for students, while the €9 is a home delivery service. And as far as I know, you don't have to prove if you're a student. So you can kind of opt for whichever one. The Irish Times as well has a free subscription for students, which you do have to verify through a university email. But I also think the subscription model that the New York Times has, where you can gift a certain amount of articles to friends or share them online if you're a subscriber, is really interesting. And I don't know if you've come across the Financial Times new app called the FT Edit. They have a really interesting model now where they are providing 8 articles per day, selected not based on the algorithm of what you're reading, but based on what the team in FT Edit are picking for you every day. And it's like a fraction of the cost that the FT would normally cost you. So I think there's lots of interesting lots of interesting experiments happening.
I've always found it peculiar, a newspaper where you want to read one article, that you can't just buy the individual article.
Yeah.
You can rent a film on YouTube now, but you can't buy one article from the New York Times.
Yeah, I haven't come across a publication that does that either, although I have heard that mentioned a lot and floated a lot. The other thing I find interesting about subscriptions as well, I do think they are necessary for high quality independent journalism and original journalism. Is that you do run into issues then of who can afford to pay and where that pushes people if they can't afford to pay, especially talking about disinformation and fake news. If you can't afford to read an article or you can't afford to pay a monthly subscription to a newspaper, you are obviously more likely to get your news from social media or places like Reddit and dark holes. So I think that's something that's worth exploring in the future as well. How do we tackle that as well?
A closing question for you. This year, the World Press Freedom Index, it's a particularly grim picture, actually, that the press in 31 countries is now deemed to be in a, quote, very serious situation. Who do you feel, as someone who writes about the media, teaches about the media, that we need to amplify and listen to and support in this world of media today?
Yeah, the attacks on journalism have just become very prevalent, and not just in autocratic countries where you might expect, also in Western democracies. And an awful lot changed on 9/11, and fundamentally it became a much more hostile place for the press in the US. And many people, again, this kind of ahistorical tendency we have, just thought, well, Bush was gone and then Obama came in and everything was great. There were more journalists and whistleblowers prosecuted under Obama's time than under the Bush administration's time using the Patriot Act. And the culture that creates then is that journalists learn, well, there are certain things we shouldn't do or are not acceptable. And as I said, what a journalist is not defined at all in law. So there are very few protections around journalism. When we talk about media freedom, it's often protection of the news outlets. These news outlets are typically either publicly owned, like an RTE or a BBC, or private companies. It's individual journalists, I think, that we need to have more protections for, because things like just being physically assaulted or attacked or being doxxed, having their details put online. And once we're in that type of a culture, people are very naturally, when, as she was just saying, you're not very well paid, you don't have great job security, you're going to start thinking twice about what you cover and who you cover. So there's no simple fix to that, but I think we need to put a lot of attention more on the journalists and not just lip service to, every politician, or almost every politician will stand up and say journalism is really important to democracy. They have to do a little bit more than that and make sure that it survives.
And then to end, I suppose, with the future of the past, as I like to call it, in terms of where history is going moving forwards. Many people might not realize that a lot of the papers that you were using in your study, thankfully, are now digitized from the Irish Newspaper Archive. They've done a brilliant job putting this material online. As more and more of these newspapers become available, and they're scanning more regional papers all the time, it's going to continue, isn't it, to change how we view that period?
Yeah, I think it will, yeah. But what it's going to reveal is that the past is in the future. I mean, there's a lot. I've become more aware even here today. of the common elements between newspapers then and contemporary problems. For example, conspiracy theories. We had the Roscommon Herald in 1918 was very good at propagating its own conspiracy theories. The editor was a man called Jasper Tully. When the conscription scare was launched, when there was a realistic threat that Ireland would be conscripted in the early months of 2018, he had an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that Lloyd George was in the hands of well-known Jews, and that he actually named the Jews, and he was wrong about 3 out of 4 of the people he mentioned. He claimed that the Russian Revolution had just happened. So he was referring to Kerensky, who had been the leader of the pre-Bolshevik government. Kerensky, followed by Lenin, Trotsky, and now the 4th one escapes me. But anyway, he was wrong about 3 of those guys, calling them, like he said Lenin was a Jew, and Kerensky. None of them were. Trotsky was the only one who was Jewish. But it just illustrates the sort of the easy way with disinformation and conspiracy theory. So there's quite a lot in common there with modern stuff.
We no longer live with the tyranny of microfilm, that we can we can search a broader section of the local press with ease from the newspaper archive is just tremendous for researching the period.
That would be, yeah, it would.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
So I just want to thank everyone for coming along to this event. Thank Eileen, Dermot and Jade for their contributions. I think we all agree we will never try and cheat our way around the paywall again. They were all in agreement on that. And Dermot's new book is available from the back of the room, from the Gutter Bookshop. But thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of the festival. We'll leave it there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, just like to say thank you so much for coming along to the RDS Library for this great and very fascinating afternoon. And thank you to our panel, Jade, Eileen, Dermot and Donal, for a very fascinating talk. Thank you.